I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not wearing a tie, and he is, but he's from D.C. He comes from Thai culture, place.
Can we have a civilization?
I know.
Can we have a civilization?
But out here in the colonies, we don't wear ties if we can get away with it.
It's a day that ends in Y.
Exactly. So we had the pleasure of actually having a conversation about your book about 3 months ago, and
brutal. You're very tough on me.
It was especially brutal because the day before you got hit by a car, and it seems fine now, thankfully. But if you were summarizing your book, one of the quickest ways to summarize your book is that your book is basically trying to answer where's our flying cars, and if we'd had flying cars, you wouldn't have gotten hit by it probably. So, where's our flying cars, Jim?
They're not here. They may be arriving. They may be arriving. Perhaps not looking exactly like the Jetsons, but they may be arriving. So I think the question I would ask is, sure, where are our flying cars? Where are our coast-to-coast nuclear reactors, so we don't have to worry about climate change? Where are cures for diseases that still plague us, but perhaps don't need to plague us? Where is the sort of, I guess more broadly, the sort of rapid economic growth that lots of smart people expected would be the regular state of affairs in this country? That's what they thought in the 50s and 60s. Again, for a brief time in the 1990s, they thought that the United States economy that we had figured something out, and that we would grow faster, and when you grow faster, we'd have fewer people in poverty, we would have, more purchasing power, and if that growth is driven by technological progress, we would have far more ability to solve big problems. And that didn't happen. And did it not happen because it couldn't have happened? Because the sorts of predictions that we got in the immediate post-war decades, and again in the 90s, those are just ridiculous predictions? Or did we make some bad decisions? And do our decisions matter? This book is about decisions, and our decisions do matter. And the fact that the average American median household income is $80,000 and not, 200,000, that's just not nature. Our decisions played a big role in that. So I guess what I'm trying to do with this book is tell people the future can be better than what we probably think it is, and our decisions will play a big role, whether it is better or if it's perhaps worse.
So you talk in the book about this upwing and downwing. That's the sort of, I don't know if it's a metaphor, but it's the phrasing that you use. And
versus left wing or right wing.
Yeah, upwing means we're going forward and upward, and downwing means we're languishing. Adam Smith said, paraphrasing, there's a lot of ruin in every nation. I assume there's a lot of upwing in every nation. Right now we're in a downwing phase. Things are hard. But where are the upwing things right now? Is there anything going on right now that you think we're bucking the downwing trend?
Whenever, I'm in Washington, so I, listen to what politicians have to say, and I try to listen very closely. And when politicians are saying, guess what? We can do better. The economy can grow faster. Economic growth is good. Like everything else, there may be problems, but also the same growth is also the solution to those problems. Then that is a politician, whether that politician calls himself a Democrat or Republican. When a politician is saying, well, I guess it would be better if we had a few more nuclear reactors. Well, that's a politician talking about. They're in upwing mode. They're in a mode where they're saying that we can solve problems. Technology is very important. That perhaps the best thing right now is not to heavily regulate AI, which has only been around for about 15 minutes. That perhaps we need to see how it plays out. That's politicians kind of in upwing mode. When immediately is what they're saying is, we still can't do nuclear. Boy, I'm terrified of artificial intelligence. It's going to ruin our elections. It's going to take all the jobs. And then when we have ruined elections and no jobs, then the robots are going to kill us. We need to regulate this thing fast. We got to pause it. So that's a politician in a downwing mode, which is better safe than sorry. And we have been in a better safe than sorry mode too much for the past half century. And when I started writing this book in 2020, the classic example, which I mentioned a couple times, is nuclear energy. But you don't have to go back to the 1970s. You can just go back to like a year and a half ago when OpenAI unrolls this new chatbot, and there were news stories saying like, "Wow, it's kind of neat. You can make lots of images, and you can make like a rap." You could have like a rap song done as if Winston Churchill wrote it. And that's kind of a fun, crazy thing. And that lasted about a week. And then after a week later, it's like, oh, by the way, when you're done having fun, it's going to take your job. And it's just going to be like the Terminator. So how many news stories, when they try to frame the issue, have pointed to like the Terminator films as a way of getting into the story? So this isn't just like about like, oh, during the 70s we didn't let nuclear power happen and too many environmental regulations and we ended the space age. It's right now. It's right now when we look at new technologies and what we see is only the problems and we focus on the problems. So yeah, there's still way too much. If you look at AI and all you're thinking about is, oh, remember all the problems with social media? Well, that is you just layering on your existing biases onto this new technology and not focusing on it's like the technology I've been waiting all my life to hopefully emerge that could accelerate this economy and solve lots of problems. We have a lot of problems, and as Americans, we've always seen technology as a tool to solve those problems.
So Ryan Murphy, my colleague, I asked him to do a
Brilliant guy.
Absolutely. Socialist protest song about economic freedom. We may actually play that the next Bridwell Institute event and flick that on you. It wasn't very good, actually. But
you know it by heart?
Well, it's going to be the new socialist ballad.
Am I supposed to urge you to sing this? Is this what this is?
At the beginning of our sessions, we're going to stand up and sing the Economic Freedom International. That's our newest thing. So in your book, and I'm a sci-fi guy. I pretty much like all versions. Science fiction's woven through the book, and I think for the most part, if I may, I think it's mostly you're using science fiction through the ages to reflect the upwing, downwing sentiment. Some science fiction is very upwing, and other science fiction is very downwing. Dystopic kind of science fiction. But I also want to ask you the reverse. Is there a role for science fiction, the art of science fiction, to drive us more in an upwing direction? Can it be actually causally helpful? Yeah. Are there artists out there who might be helping us reverse the trends?
I think it matters how we envision the future. If we have with economic growth, an economy grows faster, we become more productive. That is an economy where we'll have new companies, and the old companies perhaps, if they don't go out of business, they may shrink. It's a naturally disruptive force, which is why economists like using the phrase creative destruction. With growth comes disruption. And again, there are people may not lose their jobs, but maybe they'll have to do something different. But some jobs will disappear. And again, there'll be new companies, and the old companies may shrink, and that'll affect communities. So that is disruption. So if that's going to be worth it, if that is going to be worth it, then we have to think it will be worth it, and that in the process of that, we're going to create either sort of broadly a better world, but there will be a richer country. There'll be a country with more opportunity, a country more able to solve problems. So we have to believe that will be the case, and so that is a leap of imagination. And where science fiction can help is it can help paint possible, hopefully plausible futures that are worth striving for. And if the only images we have is specifically how these technologies will make our world worse, and to be soaking in that, not just going to a movie and seeing a movie about the future and it's negative and there's zombies or something, or the climate's gone crazy, but year after year, decade after decade, to have the bulk of the people giving us images of tomorrow, giving us those kinds of negative images, I think that, I absolutely think that matters. When in a movie, there is a cure for a disease, but that cure does turn us into zombies. I think, again, does one movie matter? Does a lifetime of watching, though? And again, we've seen this with AI, when if you were a journalist and you want to write a news story, well, I mean, the obvious thing, again, is to look at the Terminator series. But let's say that's been done to death. That's a cliche. I'm gonna write about how robots can help us. Nothing really obviously comes to mind. Well, clearly it doesn't, because I certainly don't see that. Star Trek isn't enough, and I do write about Star Trek, but that's not enough against the wave of negativity. So I think if we had a culture, whether it is science fiction or even just politicians giving more positive images about tomorrow, I think that would help. I think that would help, because I've done a lot of podcasts. People generally don't go on book tours anymore. They do lots of podcasts, and I've had so many instances where, let's say, the producer of the podcast, who's probably 25 years old, will say something to me like, "Everything you just said, everybody I know thinks just the opposite. They think we're all doomed. They think the climate's going to kill us. They think that the rich will just grow richer, and we'll lose our democracy to a plutocracy or some kind of oligarchy. They think everything's going to be worse in the future. But you're saying it won't be, or at least we have it within our power to make sure it isn't. To me, that doesn't seem healthy, and that breeds a sort of lethargic. There's nothing we can do, when I think there's a lot we can do.
So I'm a big Trekkie or Trekker, depending on your point of view, myself. And I think actually there's the PhD thesis for someone in cultural studies or something to write about Star Trek, because even the arc of Star Trek, you go back to the original series and then even Next Generation and on, it has gotten a lot less optimistic as they rolled out the various new iterations of it. And for me, the turning point was Deep Space Nine, which is a lot of people think is the best of the episodes. But the problem, if you don't know the story, Deep Space Nine, they stopped going anywhere. Deep Space Nine was Deep Station Nine. So it was everyone on all the Star Trek people, they just sat there in this station, and everyone came to them. There was no exploration. I mean, the essence of the Star Trek universe was going out and exploring, and then with Deep Space Nine, they stopped doing it. And to me, that was like the turning point in the original sort of ethos of the series.
At this point, when I usually talk about this topic, someone will say, well, yeah, obviously, you can't make a piece of drama that's optimistic. I mean, that's super boring, right? Well, no. You mentioned Star Trek. I'm glad you did that. A lot of the Star Trek, both Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, even some of the more recent ones, one of the writers was a guy who I've had on my podcast, Ronald D. Moore, maybe best well known for writing and creating the new Battlestar Galactica series. But he has a great show which he has created. It's called For All Mankind, and it's on Apple TV+. And the premise of For All Mankind is that we lost the space race, that the Soviets got there a month early, so we lost. And from that defeat, we decided we weren't going to lose again, and the space race just kept on. So for the next 50 years, America and the Soviet Union kept racing. We kept dreaming of going further out in space, and NASA got bigger, and we kept spending money on science research. And in that show, lots of things that we got in the 2000s, we got in the 80s. Electric cars, cell phones, nuclear fusion. And it's a show with a lot of drama, but it also gives a nice piece of alt history showing that if we had made different decisions, If our policymakers hadn't have acted like it didn't matter what they did, that no matter what we spent on science, no matter how we regulated, that our economy would still create like this bounty of progress. Well, that hasn't happened because our decisions do matter.
So in the last, say, year, and maybe this is an echo of my very first question, but in, say, the last 12 months, what's the most upwing tweet, upwing whatever, utterance from somebody, maybe, you know, anything? There's got to be something good, right?
I think the most encouraging thing is, like back, and I write a lot about this because I kind of think where it all went wrong was the early 1970s. That I wrote that when we started passing well-intentioned laws that turned out to make it very difficult to build anything in this country, either cheaply or quickly. When we decided to, shut down basically the space program as far as exploration or leaving low Earth orbit, when we decided that we just were too scared of nuclear power, so we really weren't going to build any more of those things, like who fought back? Like how would you fight back? Like that was the consensus opinion was that we had won the space race, now it was too expensive. The consensus opinion was environmental regulation. Businesses would adapt. We would adapt. The upsides were far better than any downsides you might imagine. And everybody knew that nuclear energy was just too dangerous. Didn't you see the China Syndrome movie about a meltdown which came out during 3 Mile Island? So that was the consensus. And if you didn't agree with it, well, what'd you do? Now, if you go on social media, you can find like-minded people who also think that. And those people, some of whom you've never heard, and some are well-known people, like venture capitalist Mark Andreessen, are talking about it and exchanging ideas, creating memes and videos. And now, thanks to AI, you can create, even someone like me probably could create a pretty good, pro-progress video. And you're able to connect, and you can make that argument in a very public way whenever you want. So that doesn't. I don't have a specific tweet, but I think the ability to make those tweets, to be on social media, to make the case for progress, that we don't have to accept a status quo where we are the victims of events and there's no problem we can't solve. I mean, I literally had this conversation with one of my daughters who was, she's very concerned about the world and she's very concerned about, like climate change. I'm like that's a problem that we can deal with. Like right now we have technologies, and those technologies will get better. So if we have a worse life in the future because of the climate, that is because we've decided not to use the tools and make better tools to solve that problem. That is a choice, and we can make a different choice.
So let's talk about the rest.
And then she hung up on me.
Let's talk about the rest of the world a little bit. I mean, one of the worst, it's terrible. You're right. We should have a per capita income of 200,000, not 80. But 80 is not terrible.
No.
And lots of the rest of the world would trade happily with us. But we're exporting this downwing hyper focus on protection. Like you mentioned the early 70s is when this began. The occupational health and safety, environmental protection agency, consumer product safety. It's one agency after the other. And we're now exporting those kind of ideas to countries whose per capita incomes are not 80, they're 10. And we're really kneecapping a lot of these societies from developing. Is anyone bucking that trend? Can you?
Well, like those countries need more economic growth. We need more economic growth. Like one thing President Trump said that I agree with, and he said, they talk about these developing countries. We're a developing country, right? Well, yeah, I think we are. We shouldn't like be satisfied with $80,000, and that $80,000 isn't just money; it also reflects a certain level of technological sophistication that can solve other problems other than just again giving you purchasing power. But my concern is that we are importing downwing attitudes from other places. When we decide that the way we're going to regulate our technology is that we are going to take the ideas from Europe, a region that's been unable to develop cutting-edge technologies for quite some time, that has been unable to generate very successful technology companies, and who now views as its comparative advantage as one of regulation. When we decide, like, oh my gosh, we're falling behind Europe in terms of regulation, that's what I'm actually worried about, is importing. And to be clear, like, guy comes from AEI, which is considered a center-right think tank, and he has a problem with regulation. Wow, that's a really shocking thing. And the thing is, I'm not against regulation. And I think some regulation, like the fact that we have much cleaner air, like that is a pro-progress thing, because that's bad. The fact that that we're no longer exposing ourselves as much to like lead in gasoline, which lowered IQs, like that's good. And generally, when countries become wealthier, they begin to focus a lot more on the downsides of economic growth, and they want to. And people are like, oh, they start valuing having a cleaner environment. That's great, and that's absolutely that happens in country after country, and I'm glad it happened in the United States. But to not look back at our reaction to pollution from 50 years ago and look at, like, well, did we overcorrect in this area? Like, if we're worried about the climate and pollution, but our laws make it like impossible, let's say you're a big fan of wind power. It's very, very difficult to build and place wind turbines in this country. Oh, it's also really difficult to build the factory to build the wind turbine in this country. Like, we're gonna, like, to meet President Biden's like wind turbine goals, we're gonna need like 25 new massive factories building wind turbines. We have like one, and we're trying to build another one. It's like a year and a half behind schedule. Millions behind schedule. They're trying to meet the voluminous environmental regulations. They have to think like what are we doing here? Like, this is not solving the problem. It's making the problem worse. Like, all that energy is going to have to go through massive new electrical power lines. But those are also really hard to build. So what can seem like a good idea at the time, you have to learn from what went wrong and correct. And we've been unable to do that.
So when you look back, I mean, a lot of the things that we can't do now, we can't, like you say, build nuclear power plants. We can't. Sometimes we can't even build, wind power. What about raw science, like pure science? We canceled the super collider in Waxahachie. I'm a big physics nerd. I love physics. Smashing protons makes me excited. But I don't think there's any practical value to humanity except pure knowledge about the Higgs boson or whatever. And so the Swiss and the French got it instead of the Americans because Congress decided to unfund it. But I still looked at that as a downwing moment. I mean, like, we just decided, it's too expensive. So what about the more pure science type things, the things that really genuinely don't, it's just for the physics guys and stuff like that?
Well, what was, the kinds of science that was just for the physics guys at the early part of the 20th century is why we have GPS today. Like, we don't know. We don't know what is going to create a wonderful device that makes sure that cuts down our commutes, allows us to get around traffic. We don't know necessarily what will be the next cure. So yeah, I'm for like lots of funding for basic science. And when the space race was over, we decided we weren't going to do that anymore at those kinds of levels. I mean, what would the world have looked like had we followed the space age with some other kind of age, and we viewed massive science funding as just something that government should do, and we followed, and There were some plans. Like I think at one point, President Nixon wanted to build 1,000 reactors. That didn't happen. But perhaps we could have had an Apollo program for nuclear fusion or something else. But we really didn't follow with anything else. Right now, we spend as a share of GDP about a third of what we did back then. I would like to return to those levels. Like that's something also that generally economists and people on the left and right should agree on. Like that business isn't going to do that kind of blue sky research, and government should. So that's something we should be able to agree on. And there was some of that in the Chips and Science Act that passed. But again, we're sort of not even funding those levels. So for some reason, we cannot get around doing what should be like the most obvious kind of government action, which I'm supposed to be optimistic, which is kind of depressing.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned GPS, because without the atomic clock, it doesn't work. Without the accuracy we have from the atomic clocks, your GPS would have you, yards off every second, and after a minute you'd be in the wrong zip code, and after an hour you'd be in the wrong state.
Listen, I love those AAA triptych maps. Remember those AAA? You go across country, you go down to the AAA office. I love those things. But we can probably do that.
But we don't need a clock that's accurate to within a second every million years. There's no real practical need for that. The airplanes, this meeting, whether it doesn't matter, but your GPS absolutely requires that. So that's just a really good example of how the pure science, which looks like welfare for scientists to some of us outsiders, in fact, is actually helping our lives.
Something like the early work with like genetics. I mean, it wasn't obvious, but now we can have reality TV shows where we can find out who's the real baby daddy. Thank you. So it always does pay. It can pay off in big important ways.
So I wrote a book called Socialism Sucks. So I like to talk about socialism. Also, I like to advertise my book every time I can. But
always push the product. Push the product.
You understand. I miss old socialists. The socialists of the 1930s, the 20s, and a little bit later even. There was a great optimism amongst that crowd. They were trying to rebuild the world. They were utterly irrational and wrong about how the world works, but there was an upwingness to old socialism, and it doesn't seem to be the case on the left. Whether they call themselves socialists or not anymore, I don't know. But do you agree that like the Bolsheviks were they upwingers or downwingers? It's the short end.
I love this question. Actually, I hate this question. There's like the Soviets, like they wanted to, a very poor country, so they had to industrialize, they had to modernize. They were going to match the U.S., and if the U.S. is going to space, they were going to space. They believed they had figured out the path, and that path should not only exist on Earth, but it should extend out into the cosmos. So they had a very expansive view of where their ideology would take and save humanity. That is not sort of the vision, that we get from people on sort of the downwing left, or really what I consider also the downwing right. And I think partially that stems out of the 70s and the great concern about the environment and a belief that capitalism was exploiting the earth and we were running out of earth and we had too many people. So certainly I think in the West, you ended up getting a left that was anti-progress, that saw progress as just exploitation, and that believed that we lived on spaceship Earth with a finite amount of everything, and if we didn't stop gobbling it up, we would all be doomed. And there's still that, and you still see that view of the world. Again, with AI, one of the criticisms of AI is that it uses a lot of energy. It uses a lot of energy to train these models. It uses a lot of energy to run these programs. And gosh, and they'll say, sure, maybe AI will cure cancer or accelerate economic growth, but it just uses up too much energy. We can't have it. So that view isn't sort of merely an artifact of the 1970s, but still the view today. So like that hasn't gone away, and that's something you see on the left, and that's also now something you see on the right, where they're also very worried that economic growth is too disruptive. So when I use the phrase upwing, which basically means we can solve problems and technology can help us solve problems, and if technology creates a problem, well, then we'll solve that problem too. So there are people who think that on the left and right, and there are people who also think the other way on the left and right. So which is why I tend not to use the left and right as being the key difference here, but really, do you think we can solve our problems, and is it worth taking the risk, or do you think we can't, and we're just going to make things worse? And even if we were able to accelerate the economy, only the people at the very top would get the gains, which is also ahistorical. So it's just not worth taking any risk. And I think if you know where people come down on that, I think that will tell you a lot. And like I said, I'm center right. If I know someone on the center left and they kind of think in these upwing terms, we get along great. I think we could probably solve a lot of problems together.
So I want you to talk a little bit more about the reaction to the book. The Conservative Futurist is the title. First word there is conservative. But I think I overheard you say earlier that many of your most prominent complaints have come from nominally people who call themselves conservatives. So why, you think of yourself as conservative, I more or less think of myself as a conservative. Why are many people out there who call themselves conservatives not happy with your book?
The logical question you should ask anyone who calls himself a conservative is, what are you trying to conserve? Like, right? That's the name, the word conserve. So what are you trying to conserve? Are you trying to conserve, or perhaps even bring back, a way of life that has been relegated to times past? Maybe that's what you think is valuable. And that is what you're trying to conserve. Are you trying to return America to a place where families look different, where society look different? That is not what I am trying to conserve. What I am trying to conserve is the legacy of liberal democracy and market capitalism that was sort of bequeathed to us from the late, both from the American Revolution and then from the Industrial Revolution. That legacy of freedom, economics, and politics, like that is what I am trying to conserve. And that is what I'm trying to then build upon and pass along to the next generation. So those ideas, those principles are what I am trying to conserve. Where some people, they view conservatism as that we have lost something and we need to return to that. And like, I want to conserve principles, but I don't want to conserve or return to the way America looked like in 1956.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to where we can build the Golden Gate Bridge in 3 years. The state of Texas is trying to expand my road in front of my house for 3 miles, and it's taken 4 years, and we're still counting. So if you want to go back in time to that, in the state of California, you can't build 10 miles of train track in 10 years. Right? It's just absurd. So we're going to kind of work towards a conclusion. We're going to do a rapid fire quiz. And your assignment is to, so the question is upwing, downwing, explain.
Oh boy, I love.
Okay, so this is quiz
quizzes.
time. FDR.
Upwing or down?
Downwing, explain.
Upwing or downwing? Well, I don't know. Generally, I think when you win wars and smash fascists, I'm not going to look much beyond that. I don't like the sort of the inherent criticism of capitalism. In fact, the American Enterprise Institute was created as a response to FDR and the New Deal. But again, when you win a war, I'll give you a little leeway. I guess certainly economic policies are not my economic policies.
I think I agree. Basic income guarantee, and you maybe want to tell people what that is, but
everybody gets a check. Everybody gets a check, and maybe that check will be we get rid of the rest of the entire welfare state. You get a check, or maybe you get a check just because we'll keep all that too. And that has come up a lot lately. This notion. Andrew Yang, who ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, that was his big issue, that in fact the robots were going to take all the jobs, and therefore government's going to have to give everybody a check. That to me is extremely downwing, because one, you're assuming that things were going to be so different that we can throw history out the window, when in fact in the past new technology has replaced some things we do, it has made us more efficient at others, and it's created lots of brand new things. And to assume that that history should be relegated to the ash heap, to me is downwing. And oh, by the way, Andrew Yang, who ran for president, predicted that in the year of our Lord 2024 that we would already be having AI riots, that the truckers would have already be all out of jobs, and the truckers would be rioting and shutting down our highways. That is yet to happen.
So some of these are going to be easy, but the explanation is still going to be worth something. So Putin.
Oh my gosh, downwing. I think when you reject the what we were given by the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. Russia was on a bit of an upwing path. It now seems to be, I think it's called downwing, actually misses a lot, because it seems to be going to a very dark place as a country.
Donald Trump.
He likes rockets. I love rockets. I love space.
He's
so
a builder.
That's good.
You know, he builds buildings. Sort of.
Yeah, I used to. Golf courses. A big part of my vision is that there's a lot of ways to look at like economic growth, and the classic sort of economist way is to look at, is think about capital and labor. Another way to look at it is looking at about ideas, and what creates economic growth is ideas, and people being able to collaborate and share ideas, and then those ideas meet and they become different ideas. So the ability to collaborate and connect with people is like core to my upwing vision. And policies that do not allow people to connect, that do not allow people to go to places where they can meet other smart people and connect with their ideas, and where we cannot easily move and trade and travel, those are downwing policies. So I would have, certainly I think those aspects of the Trump agenda would be pretty downwing. And again, those are hardly limited to the right. You find plenty of that on the left.
Alexander Hamilton.
I know you. He asked me this before. And he was wrong then, he's wrong now. Alexander Hamilton was an upwing founding father. He believed in economic modernization. We're not going to live on farms like Jefferson wanted. Is that what you want? Do you want us all to stay on farms forever in our little agrarian rural communities? No, that kind of reminds me of the people in the 70s who wanted us to all go back on farms and live in communes and just be with the earth. Is that what you want? Upwing.
That's wrong.
I thought I had it. I thought I improved my answer.
Yeah, well, you did actually. You were warned about it. The question. So I think downwing. I think of protectionism, nativism.
We've learned a lot about economic policy in the past 200 years.
Yeah,
sometimes it's very difficult to hold people to.
Right. Yeah.
Like I'm not sure what he thought the proper capital gains tax rate was.
That's true.
Maybe you know.
All right.
Maybe you have that idea.
How about say the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese right now?
I do not believe that was about the economic advancement of poor countries. That was about the economic advancement of China. So I think upwing policies are policies that take poor people and make them less poor. And that while that happened in China, that is not the vision they are exporting to other countries. So the Belt and Road Initiative, I guess that would be downwing. Plus, I think all that stuff's falling apart too.
And I'm pretty. This is the last thing. I'm pretty sure you failed in your assignment from January, which was to watch Firefly.
I did not watch.
So I'm going to reiterate.
I was healing.
You
I was healing.
You had one job over the last 3 months, and you failed. but you should watch Firefly because I want to hear your opinion about that Sci-Fi series. Because I'm not even sure where I stand on that. Framing it as upwing and downwing is a nice framing for evaluating something like a science fiction show, and I'm not sure where Firefly sits, and it's my favorite science fiction.
Ask me about Dune
series.
That's like
Tell us.
Dune, where if you've seen Dune, the world of Dune, it happens thousands of years after they outlaw the computer, and look how miserable they are.
Yeah.
You shouldn't outlaw the computer, the Butlerian jihad.
Well, thank you, Jim. Let's move towards.
There is economic policy in the book.
There's a lot.
Focus.
There's a lot.
You focus on the science fiction, but that's fine.
Yeah. That's the fun stuff. That's the stuff I like. I know about economic policy already, so I wanted to read about the science fiction. So please, ladies and gentlemen, there's 2 microphones. If anybody has a question, feel free to send it down. There we go.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you for being so generous in giving us your book tonight. I'm really looking forward to reading it. And the key point we were talking about was your definition of 73 as the major turning point. And I was trying to remember what that was like when I was 10. But I remember the petrol crisis in the Middle East and Watergate, our political domestic crisis. And I think those were things that shaped our lives and changed. And it was interesting that you've addressed so many points about technology and the future and innovation and having to have brain power bring the future together. So my question is, how does your theory line up against the demographic growth over that period? Back then we were 3 billion people and now we're 8 billion people. So how does that play out for how resources are allocated and how people are in a changed world and a lot of pressure?
I think there were 7 good points in what you said. So I'm trying to figure out which ones I want to address, because as you were saying them, things kept popping off in my head. Well, I'll start saying that, like, the major crisis governments around the world have to face, and not just in rich countries, are going to be declining population. They're already experiencing it in Japan. They're not ready for it. It's going to probably decline a lot faster than what we're prepared for. We don't know what it's like to be in a modern industrial economy where the population is declining. There'll probably be a global scramble for immigrants. Not every country is going to be as able to win that competition. The U.S. could if we want to. So like going forward, like that's going to be the concern, that there aren't enough people. And generally, when you don't have enough people, the economies tend to do worse, and I think that is going to be a big concern. Now, of course, it was very easy to generate a lot of economic growth back in the 70s because you did have like this rapidly growing population. People were super worried about population explosion and using up all the resources. I don't think that is the issue then. But you also mentioned something about the oil crisis in '73. Is that when statistically the U.S. downshifted into lower productivity growth, which is by far the most important economic statistic. We're more productive, wages can go up, we get more from less, we figure out new things to do. That's an important statistic, and the U.S. productivity downshifted in 1973 statistically. And when that happened, everyone said it was like, oh, it's the oil crisis. So as soon as the oil crisis is over, everything will go back to the way it was in the booming 60s, but it didn't. So it took them like 10 years to figure out like that wasn't the case. And we've been struggling and perhaps waiting for that productivity growth to return. It returned to the 1990s. Now it's gone away again. There are a few good signs. I think AI will help that. But yeah, that's right. I go back to '73. A lot was happening there. And the thing is, if you want, and this is sort of not really your question, but one of the things I worry about is sort of the skepticism about democracy. And you see it in this country and in other countries. And if you want people who live in democracies to be enthusiastic about democracies, I think government needs to perform well. And if we don't perform well and they're unable to deliver economic growth and solve problems, people will become skeptical of democracy. And so I think one reason people are skeptical of democracy is that a lot of people just went through a decade where lots of things didn't go very well. Whether it was a pandemic, which everybody warned about, but we still didn't seem to be ready, whether it was the financial crisis, whether it was the war in Iraq. When democracies don't seem to be operating, people live in those democracies think, well, gosh, maybe it's our form of government, which also wasn't your question, but thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Quantum computing, upwing, and if so, how can we make it go faster upwing?
Well, I'm not a technologist, so I can't tell you how to improve the technology. I know people are super enthusiastic about it. I'm not sure even people have a very good idea like what we'll do with it. But like, there's a lot popping right now. When I started writing this book, when I was going to call it like Lost Future, I was far more pessimistic. And in the course of writing it from like June of 2020 until I finally handed a manuscript in I think early 23, the United States regained the ability to take humans into orbit, which we had lost. And thanks to SpaceX, we got that back. All of a sudden, the FDA pipeline has begun to be flooded with treatments for all manners of diseases using CRISPR, using genetic editing, including sickle cell disease, which was just in the New York Times. And in that period, we had ChatGPT roll out. So from the time where I started, I'm hoping that we are in a period where we're as we've seen in the past, where we have a sort of a confluence of technologies. I think that could solve problems, accelerate growth, and that I hope from a public policy perspective, we don't screw up. Hope.
First of all, I love your optimism. I think it's hard if you look back on your childhood to think of all the things you never dreamed that you might have that you now just take for granted. And I have two daughters who, are a bit fatalistic, growing up on the dystopic science fiction. I remind them that somehow I managed to survive overpopulation, acid rain, the ozone depletion, and 40 years of climate change, which I've survived in 12-year increments somehow. So, but I look back at the late 1800s and early 1900s, the market change that occurred in this country and all over the world, and some folks have argued that it actually incrementally was more of a change than we've had in the last, say, 50 years. And that occurred in an environment of minimal regulation. Entrepreneurship was at its peak. Government stayed out of the way. Individuals were paramount. And I wonder, and I hear you kind of dance around it a little bit, that governments need to do this and governments need to do that. And I'm wondering, we had the space race, but NASA was running it. That's a government agency. We had Nixon's silver bullet with NIH. We're going to cure cancer in the next 10 years. Well, still here.
We did not cure cancer.
And that's another government agency. And nuclear power, well, the nuclear commissions, that's another government agency. I'm wondering, and maybe I'm preaching to the crowd here, or preaching to the choir, is the answer really just to get government the hell out of the way?
I think in some areas, see that when I try to, and like the answer to the question you are asking, which is sort of the what went wrong. So what went wrong? And this is a question economists still think about. Like this slowdown I mentioned in 1973, which was super surprising to people. Whether they were CEOs or government economists, by the end of the 1960s, they were all super, and there were things going wrong in the world. There was a lot of civil strife. We had Vietnam, but still, when it came to like the economy and technology, they were super optimistic. So like this downshift was super surprising. It was also surprising that it never seemed to really end, other than really the late 1990s. So like the what went wrong question is what I try to answer in the book. And some of the things that went wrong is, well, all these great inventions that we had in the late 1800s, we sort of extracted like the productivity gains we could out of, we electrified the country. Everywhere we could put an internal combustion engine, we put an internal combustion engine. Like we did that, but we didn't really replace it with anything as important. So like that, because you see this slowdown in lots of countries, so you have to look at like what happened that would affect a lot of countries. Those kinds of things. It's kind of like, but our decisions mattered too. And in some cases, we started doing less of what government should do, and I'll mention things like basic science. But in other areas, governments are doing some things that it should not have done. Or perhaps we'll give people the benefit of a doubt that maybe they did things which seemed smart at the time, but then they forgot to look back and say, like, is that still working? Is that environmental law that we passed in 1970, which a lot of people call the National Environmental Policy Act, which we passed in 1970, which when it passed Congress, people were like, well, you know, it was kind of like a mom and apple pie kind of law. We just said like, well, we should think about like the downsides, and you know, when the government does big things, has become a law that makes it very hard to do anything, either quickly or on budget in this country. And it was obvious within a few years that that's going to be the impact of that law. So in some areas, we've made it very hard to be entrepreneurial in the real world, as opposed to the internet. And so in that area, government should be doing less. And in other areas, government should be doing more. And the ability to figure that out, like the lens to figure that out is it making it harder to innovate? Well, if that thing, because we're not doing it, makes it harder to innovate, then we should be doing it. But if that thing makes it harder to innovate because we stopped doing it, well, let's start doing it again.
So I'm interested in reading your book because I don't quite know how to relate to this concept of a downshift over the last 50 years. I graduated with a degree in electrical engineering in 1982 and witnessed the impact of Moore's Law for at least 20 years, right? And growth of PC computers and the internet and so forth, and I'm not quite sure how to relate to this downshift concept. But, you know, I have within me this, you know, core optimism about the future even now as I'm, you know, approaching 65. It astonishes, or I hear about the 25 and under generation and the kind of questions you got when you mentioned this podcast you were in. And it shocks me when I see evidence of that in real people. You know, I hear stories about it and I'm not quite sure how to relate to it. You know, why are they missing out on all the benefits of that's what's been achieved in my lifetime to give them a sense of optimism rather than a sense of pessimism?
Yeah. First, the information technology revolution was a real thing. Moore's Law has been a real thing. It just has not been important enough to change that overall economic trajectory, which I talked about. It has not been enough for the economy to grow as fast in the past, in the 50s, in the 60s. What we saw in the late 90s, where we saw the fruits of a lot of that innovation in Moore's Law, and the economy really accelerated, and people thought like the late 90s were going to go on forever, but then we downshifted again. So the IT revolution has been really, really important, just not enough to change. Though, of course, if the IT revolution ends up creating AI, then, you know, AI that can actually change the economy, then we'll have a different conversation. I think for young, and again, I have 7 kids, and many of whom are in that exact like 20 to 30 age bracket. And what they have seen is lots of craziness. They've seen they've seen a very bad economy. They know about the financial crisis, and then an economy which did not recover particularly quickly after that financial crisis, and then the pandemic. So lots of things have gone wrong. And then supporting sort of that, what they see with their own eyes is a culture that says things have gone wrong and they're not going to get any better. Like, where is that optimism going to come from? It's not going to come from the culture. It's not going to come from too many politicians who have all sort of adopted, I think, broadly the kind of a downwing perspective. I think the forces of the downwing on the left and the right are growing at this point still, certainly not shrinking. And one of the most interesting things, 'cause I write about education in the book, and there's a great website called Our World in Data. Great website, and what it just presents in lots of like nice charts is it looks at the world, and it's all great numbers. It's very empirical, and the view of the world presented in those charts is not the view of the world most people, forget in their 20s, or most people are in their 30s and 40s. They don't understand that like way fewer people live in deep poverty in this world than they did 25 years ago. That rich economies are able to produce a lot of economic growth with fewer carbon emissions than they used to. They're just utterly unaware. And if we're not telling them that, and our schools aren't teaching them that, then shame on us.
Last question.
Okay. Yeah, this is something, I hadn't read your book, so I don't know if you covered this or not, but one of the real problems I think of stopping growth is wars. And, we had World War I, World War II, and we've been without wars for a long time. But now it looks like we're sliding back into wars. Your science fiction stuff has a lot of wars in it. Is there any way that you think that somehow we can bridge the wars that are so destructive and waste so much resources? Any ideas and technology that could solve those issues?
Well, it's interesting, and I mentioned this briefly in the book, is that when you try to figure out like what happened in the early 1970s, not just to the United States, but to other rich countries, you have to also kind of point to World War II, in which Europe, particularly the Central Europe, was a scientific hotbed. And that's where, if you last checked, a lot of the war happened. So that certainly was not positive for continued economic growth once we got past those early war years. So yeah, I'm not a big believer in. People can point to war as being as generating economic progress because we're sort of forced, and a lot of interesting things came out of World War II. Radar, that's pretty important. But generally, I think like a world where people aren't hungry and feel like their needs are being met and feel like problems can be solved is probably going to be a peaceful world. I sure hope so.
I'm going to give Henry, sorry, Jeannie, I'm going to give Henry the last question, but you can come down and ask it afterwards, or we'll come up to you.
I will answer questions, afterwards, despite your rather authoritarian hand here.
It's a quick one, a very simple one. You think it's too much science fiction? Imagine having back some common sense and kill the hypocrisy that we are seeing in journalism and the public debate right now?
My background is as a journalist, and my experience is that too few journalists knew anything about economics. They didn't understand statistics. I still see that. I think when you are able to understand these things, you have a very different view of the world because it's more reality-based. So I'm not sure that answers your question. The facts are out there. I feel like I have the facts on my side. And the fact that we have too many journalists who aren't really interested in that, to me, it's sort of depressing, since that is a profession I grew up in and I really loved.
So our predecessor organization was the O'Neill Center before we became the Bridwell Institute. And Bill O'Neill from Investors Business Daily.
Yeah.
And he established a chair in journalism here at SMU, and the stated objective was to generate better business education amongst business journalists.
None of them know anything.
And with all due respect to the journalism program, it's not done well. It's just been really difficult to get journalist students interested in actually learning basic things like, principal and interest, how bonds are priced, basic finance.
Even people who are business journalists, I am shocked.
Yeah.
Like how they get like very basic things wrong. And if you watch the debate about whether to break up Google or Amazon, you'll see that very clearly, that they fundamentally don't understand how business works, and that's not helpful either when you live in a capitalist country.
Well, thanks, Jim. Let's do it again.